Well, thank you all for joining us. Welcome, on a windy day in Washington, D.C., a snowy day in the Northeast. Hope wherever you are, things are well. My name is Joe Swimmer. I'm the Executive Director of the Episcopal Parish Network, and we are pleased to again this year present this discussion about philanthropy and the impact of philanthropy on the church with our friends from Bank of America and our esteemed former board member, former board president, so many accolades, Pam Wesley Gomez. I will let them introduce themselves in just a moment, but in the meantime, I'm going to ask you to please post in the chat where you are dialing in from, your name, your parish, if you would, that would be great, just for the benefit of our panelists. Also, we would ask if you have questions or comments, please post those in the chat and they will be looked at as we go along during the session. My final note is that we will be gathering these folks and other esteemed colleagues and thought leaders and experts and just wonderful people together in Houston this coming March. It's only 3.5 weeks away, March 6th through 9th, for a terrific 39th annual EPN conference. We hope that we will see many of you there, and you can find out more information at the website that I put into the welcome I posted in the chat. So I have said enough, and now I'm going to hand it off to Bill and to Pam, and look forward to really fruitful conversation. Bill, over to you.
Thanks very much, Joe. And you're now going to disappear from the screen. Bill Jarvis here. I had thought leadership in Bank of America's philanthropic division. I've done this work for about 20 years, as many of you know, and I'm happy to be the editor of the Bank of America study of philanthropy, which we're going to review today with a specific focus on Episcopal institutions, speaking from my heart as a lifelong Episcopalian and a member of the parish at Christ Church in Greenwich, where Pam has also worshiped before she moved to South Carolina. So Pam, why don't you introduce yourself, please, to people who already probably know you.
Welcome, everyone. I'm seeing a lot of people that I recognize from all over the country. I have been focusing on really parish and Episcopal philanthropy since 1987, when I was the first staff stewardship director hired at Christ Church, Greenwich. I then went to work for the Episcopal Church Foundation. I saw Jim Murphy is on this call, and co-authored a book on funding future ministry, on planned giving, went to William and Mary for 90 hours of tax law. And then I went up to Berkeley Divinity School for 23 years, where I helped teach seminarians about philanthropy and raising money, since it is going to be such a turning point in the coming years. And I finally ended up with Grace-Based Films, which aired A Case for Love just last month all over the country. So I've spent my life raising money for the church I love, and I hope I can be helpful to you today. Oh, Stan Twardy from St. Mark's, sorry. There's a blast from the past.
Well, thanks, Pam. And that film about the presiding bishop has had tremendous release. So I know we're very grateful for your work on that. The way we're going to spend our time today in the next hour is I'm going to put up on the screen in a minute a few slides overviewing the study of affluent philanthropy. And then Pam and I have prepared some questions and conversation that dig more deeply into the state of philanthropy in the Episcopal Church and steps that we hope you'll be able to take to improve what you're doing in your parish or diocese or organization. So I'm going to share my screen now and put this up to full screen, and I hope you can all see it well enough. This is the 2023 Bank of America study of philanthropy, and it is a study that is undertaken every couple of years in partnership with the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. These are the people who do a study of mass philanthropy, mass giving, called Giving USA, which comes out every year and which many of you may have seen. This is different. This is a study of what we call affluent households. And what we're going to do now is go through some of the key findings here. And if we look here, this is essentially the size of the study. We undertake the study with a well-known opinion research group called Ipsos, and we go out to 1,626 households who have agreed to take the study and who, importantly, are pre-qualified. We'll talk about what that means, but basically, when we say affluent, what we're looking for is people who have at least $1 million in net worth, not including their home, or $200,000 in annual income. And we're also reaching out to a diverse population. And you can see here through these various groups that we have oversampled into households headed by women, households headed by the younger generation, millennials, Gen Z, bearing in mind that the leading end of the millennial generation is now 42 years old. And so these are people who are coming into either earning, founding companies, or as heirs have means. LGBTQ plus individuals, Asian Americans, Hispanic, Latino, Blacks, African Americans, not all Episcopalians by any means, but the society around us. And why is this diverse group important? Well, it's important because of what's on this page. This is not from our study. This is from the Pew Research Center. And this basically goes rather crudely, generation by generation. At the top, you see the so-called silent or greatest generation, and you go down all the way to Gen Z. And it's a very clear narrative. The navy blue slice, which is the white slice of that particular cohort, has gradually gotten less and less as the generations have been born, to the point where we now see millennials and Gen Z just a little more than half white, substantially more diverse, 23, 25% Hispanic Latino, 13, 14% Black African American, 6, 7% Asian American, and then some other. The reason I show this to you is that when you think of your boards, when you think of your major donors, you may be thinking of people who look like me or who look like the top two sets of bars here, whereas in reality, we have philanthropic individuals who walk among us, who are in this diverse population, and this is not only the population that is going to exist, it's the population that exists now. And so this is important, Pam. I know we'll be talking about this as well in terms of the future of the church in society, and society as something that supports philanthropic activities. Now, America is classically a philanthropic place. In 2022, according to this mass survey, Giving USA, nearly $500 billion was contributed, and most of it was not from foundations. Nearly 3/4 came from individuals, so individual giving matters. But there is a bifurcation. That $34,917 number on the right-hand side of this slide is the average given by the affluent households in our study in 2022. And by comparison, there is this bifurcation. Average households are giving much, much, much less, about $2,600 each year. And so fortunately or unfortunately, this means that you need to pay attention to this affluent population and what they're doing and why they're doing it. So this shows the trajectory of our study over the last several years. We've been doing the study every couple of years since 2006. So it goes back quite a far ways. The red line is our study, the participation in giving to charity by affluent households. And then the blue line below that is the mass giving. As you can see, giving has been on the decline, generally speaking. This is a topic that we're going to discuss. Fewer households are giving, but if you think about it, 85% of households in 2022 giving to at least one charity, that's still pretty good. Call it 4 out of 5, close to 9 out of 10. On the other hand, we see this 50% number, which is the most recent number we have in 2018, for general households giving to charity. And that number at the turn of this century, in the year 2000, was 66, 67%, 2/3 of households giving. What was the inflection point? Well, it was the global financial crisis, in which household balance sheets were damaged and did not recover. And so we see this hollowing out, as it were, of mass giving, meaning that there's more and more dependence on affluent giving. It's even worse than this, in the sense that when we look among the affluent, I mentioned that our threshold for entry is $1 million in net worth. The average net worth actually in the study, I don't have a slide on this, it's $35 million. The average annual income in our study is $500,000 a year. So these are people that think of it as sort of the top 4% of assets and income in the United States. And here we see in our study the giving by slices, less than $1 million in assets, 1 to 5 million, 5 to 20 million. And you can see very easily that it's that $5 to $20 million slice, if you have access to it, that is likely to be the source of the most meaningful gifts, giving around $50,000 a year on average, as opposed to much smaller amounts by the less well-endowed groups. That being the case, it should stand to reason that those with the $5 to $20 million are also, we can infer, likely to be older. We do have some heirs in the study, but in many cases, and say in most cases, the money it is being generated in the study is in fact made within that generation. These are people who have businesses, who are creating value, and some of them do become conspicuously successful. Now, in terms of giving to religious versus secular organizations, this is also a topic that you need to be aware of, because if we look at the study from 2017, 2020, 2022, these last 3 iterations of the study, I showed you already on the left-hand side, giving going from 90% down to 85% in our affluent population. Giving to secular charities has more or less held up. 85 to 82% of households giving to at least one secular charity, but giving to religious organizations is declining. In 2017, it was 49%. Before that, it was still about half. Now you see 39% giving to religious institutions. And I don't have a slide on this, but I can show you, I can tell you that giving in terms of by region in the country is also, there is a big difference. So if you look, for example, in the Northeast, giving to religious institutions is much, much smaller. We here in the Northeast, where I live, where Pam used to live, it is an increasingly secular society. Whereas in the Southeast and in the West, you still see substantial participation in religious giving, partly because social church going as a custom still exists, and in the West, possibly because of the existence of our Mormon brothers and sisters. Now, the other thing that you have to realize is that you have competition when you're looking for gifts. Families and affluent people don't just give to one charity, they give to an average of 6. In our last study, it was 7. And as you can see, about half are giving to 4 or 5 or more charities. So the church is in there. It may be even one of the anchors, but it's not the sole target of giving. Now, this is probably what you came for, and we'll be talking about this throughout our conversation, but this is a list on the left-hand side of causes that people can give to. And what we're showing you here is the navy blue bar at the top is the 2020 study. The sky blue bar just below that is the 2022 study. And this is the incidence of giving. This is the percentage of households that gave to a particular cause. And you can see that basic needs charities, food, clothing, shelter, have consistently been at the top, material needs, but that religious organizations are right below that. Bearing in mind that churches, synagogues, temples, mosques are often themselves vectors for the distribution of basic needs, food, clothing, shelter, through clothes facilities, food banks, and so on. So people are coming for religious sustenance and comfort, but there is also this social benefit aspect to religious institutions that has to be acknowledged, even though it's hard to tease out. Other institutions and causes down here, one that you'll notice, the third from the bottom, we put in the 2022 survey, and we asked, well, what about social or racial justice causes? We had never asked that before. 22% of the households said that in 2020, they gave to a social or racial justice cause. In 2022, that had gotten nearly in half to 12%. So you see there's a social cycle as well that's going on here that you may or may not like, but it's part of the way philanthropy seems to work. But there are these longer trends with basic needs, religion, health, education, typically being at the top. And this is what we see in terms of the dollars given. Religious institutions historically and still consistently getting the highest percentage of the dollars, 32% of the dollars in 2020, 39% of the dollars in 2022. Higher education, these numbers bounce around a bit, but 24% of the dollars going to higher ed in 2022. Basic needs charities coming in, again, pulling their weight. One thing you'll notice is that the navy blue bar in many of these is longer than the sky blue bar. What was it about 2020 that was different? Well, of course, in 2020, you had institutions and organizations facing existential crises. They had to shut down, they couldn't perform their services. And so you had affluent people, as we saw in our conversation last year, Pam, giving into these organizations. In 2022, that pulled back a bit. So you see, for example, arts and culture getting 5% of the money in 2020, only 2% in 2022. Social or racial justice causes, what I mentioned a few minutes ago, 5% of the money in 2020, down to 1% in 2022. So you can see these 3 causes, religion, higher education, basic needs, are the 3 anchor causes to which donors have historically given. I also have to tell you that there are differences by age, and I've alluded to this. This slide shows the response of our affluent population cut by age. Remember, the dark blue bar here would be over 42 years old, sky blue bar would be 42 and under, your millennials and Gen Zs, across a bunch of causes. And we ask, well, what are the causes that matter most to you? And you can see some big differences. So for example, slightly to second from the left, climate change is twice as important, twice the proportion of millennials and Gen Z say this is one of our most important causes versus only 13% of their elders. Education also similarly outpacing. What happens when we go over to religious life? Second from the right, significantly less important to that younger generation. Again, something to bear in mind. And it also is borne in mind when we go to the actual giving by age. Here we see on the left giving to religious or spiritual service or development, again, significantly less among that sky blue bar than among their elders. Also, interestingly, giving to basic needs, less. So in general, we're seeing perhaps less of a philanthropic approach to the younger generation, at least in some ways. And this may be part of their station in life, but it may be also something to watch further going forward in terms of the way our society develops. And again, I referred to arts and culture, that's the third from the right. You can see slightly, only barely half of younger generation giving to those institutions, which would be your theater companies, museums, symphony orchestras, that kind of thing, with results that have yet to be foreseen. Now, when we talk about giving, it doesn't come out of a vacuum, and it's important to understand why people give. You would think that they might give out of need, but need is fourth from the top on this page when we ask why you choose an organization, how you choose an organization to support. What's most important? 70% of our donors say, oh, my personal values, my personal beliefs, religious beliefs, philosophical beliefs. Second would be interest in the issue area, and this could be interest in eternal salvation, as in Christianity and the Episcopal Church. It could also be interest in the programs offered by a diverse and lively parish. And then reputation matters. Reputation is important. We've seen nonprofits fall by the way, so keeping that reputation open is important. And then fifth, firsthand experience, getting recruited by somebody, this neighborhood or social effect is important as well. Now, I've talked about giving. I want to turn now to volunteering, because volunteering is, first of all, an important part of parish life. But secondly, it also shows a way into giving. So we ask, why are you motivated to volunteer? Oh, here at the top, I responded to a need. So here the need does come first. That person comes in, they might be ushering, they might be serving on a committee, they might be singing in the choir, they might be doing other packaging food for a distribution. They're responding to a need. And then they come in and they look around and they say, wow, second, I believe I'm making a difference here. This is important to me. Remember when we looked up here? Belief that my gift can make a difference, recognizable nonprofit. So here, believing I can make a difference. And then personal values and beliefs and being concerned about a particular cause or group of area. So these things should begin to rhyme with each other. The volunteering, I believe, is a gateway to further giving. And in fact, we can see here on this slide that those who volunteer give more than 3 times as much on average as those who do not volunteer. So when you're thinking about how to involve people, you don't have to drag them into changing their whole lives to go to church all the time, but getting them involved in something in what you're doing, allowing them to discern that your values are aligned with their values and they want to be there and they see the institution, the church is effective, can be a very useful way to begin to engage these people in such a way that they then acquire the confidence to be able to make a gift. Now, once the gift has been given, people don't go away. As a matter of fact, when we think about the younger generation, they don't even use the word donation anymore. People my age would say, oh, I made a donation, I wrote the check. The younger generation uses the term investment. And when you make an investment, you don't walk away, you stick around to see what's going on. So donors are going to gauge the impact of their giving from you, from the organization that they donated to. They're going to look around and say, well, what happened? What was done with my money? This is where transparency and accountability in the Episcopal Church and in your parishes make a big difference, and their own perception. Again, they're going to see how that effect was in terms of being there. Other causes, again, other methods of discerning, volunteering, again. And then there's all of these other things that you see, Charity Navigator, the media, and public reporting. But in a church, you're really talking about a very personal, almost literal conversion process. to do that proof statement that shows that the gift that was given actually did have the effect that they intended. Now, in the church environment and in philanthropy generally, almost all the gifts that are given are from cash, check, credit card. And then we see, as you can imagine, with food banks, clothing, food inventory, household items being given. But wealth in this country is actually held about 85% in non-liquid, non-cash assets. And so, Pam, I know we're going to talk about this, but it behooves you as churches and parishes and dioceses to be thinking about ways to receive things that are not typically liquid historically. We here at Bank of America have a whole division of the bank that are my teammates in what we call specialty asset management, where we can help institutions that have received gifts of farmland or timberland or oil and gas leases, mineral rights, art collections, that kind of thing, either to hold them and to get income out of them, or to value them and sell them and put that into the endowment. So this is an important part of realizing that the cash, check, credit card, although you see it as the major part of your donations, are not actually the way wealth is held. And so being open to that ability to take in different kinds of gifts, particularly in terms of bequests, planned giving, is very important. Now, the sources of charitable giving do come mostly from personal assets and income, but it's important to realize that there are other causes that are coming up. Look at this little donut here. We have 10% of the funds coming in from donor-advised funds, something that's growing pretty quickly. There are family foundations, 4% of the gifts come from there, but other charitable giving vehicles or charitable trusts also matter. And when we think about giving vehicles, here's a list of the different types of vehicles. Of course, the most is, again, the navy blue bar is I have it now. The sky blue bar is I intend to have one or establish one in the next 3 years. And the most frequently used one, of course, is the will with charitable provisions. I want to leave a certain part of my estate to the church or the diocese. But here comes planned giving. Very, very important to have that as a factor in your church, in your diocese. Also being aware, number 3 here, of the existence of these qualified charitable distributions from an IRA. This is a category that did not exist before the 2017 Tax Act. As you can see, it's bulked up quite large. Donor advised funds right behind it. And then finally, the things that you and I might think about: an endowment fund, a giving circle, private foundation, charitable LLC, again, another new giving vehicle. And in terms of digital giving, this is a category that we started looking at during the pandemic, during the shutdown. Across the board here in our affluent population, more than half are very comfortable with giving through the nonprofit's website. So does your church, does your parish have the ability to give through their website? And then here's 15% saying, I gave through payment processing apps, Zelle and things like this. And then down at lower levels, but more significant for younger populations, crowdfunding, social media, even text to give. So these are things that you need to be aware of. You may not necessarily want to establish them right away, but given what I think I showed you earlier about NextGen and about their approaches, it probably behooves you to get someone on the parish staff or someone in the parish community to be thinking about this and putting this in place. Since this is not a future that's coming at you, it's a presence that is here now among part of your parish, and they want to do this. So that's the overview, and we've taken a certain amount of time with this, but I want now, Pam, to bring your voice into the conversation. Pam, we put topics here in 3 categories: things that we thought or you thought were notable about the findings, things that we thought were hopeful about the findings, and things that we thought were actionable about the findings. And so, Pam, let me just give you the microphone now. I've been through this at a certain level. And by the way, for those of you who are listening today, you will be receiving not these slides, but you'll be receiving the full report from the study, which contains everything I've gone through today, plus more. And of course, Pam and I are available to help you, and we will be at the Episcopal Parish Network annual conference in a few weeks. So Pam, over to you. We see the giving declining, these generational differences. Tell us a little bit about how you see this population in the world here.
Well, I want to begin by saying that I've spoken to so many parishes throughout the country, and it used to be that 20% of your members gave 80%, then it dropped to 10% were giving 90%, and now we're really down to 5% giving the majority of your operating budgets or your special. And I think it's just so critical that everyone on this call knows who is in their congregation. And not always will your pledging members be your most affluent members. A lot of them either are giving through donor advised funds or in ways that aren't going to show up as a normal pledge coming across a rector's desk or a stewardship director's. So it's really, and I know this is counterindicated from the church, but so many parishes now take their mailing list and put them through a liquid net worth study, cost a penny a name, and you'll at least know if you're speaking to the right individuals and who are the 3% that could make or break your church in the next 20 years with this transfer of wealth. I think it's 72. Let me just I wrote it down. um 84 trillion dollars will change hands in the next 2 decades, and 72 trillion will go to heirs. So there's 10 trillion or more that will go to parishes and charitable giving if we do our job right now. The giving to religious organizations has declined since 2017. I think that's actually a typo. I think the last study was 2020. But in the
No, actually,
pandemic,
it is 2017, Pam. It's a longer
thank you.
trajectory, right? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. But even during the pandemic, I was still working at Berkeley and everybody was locked down. So I actually had my most successful giving years because people were eager to connect by phone or
Mhm.
Zoom. And now we're all back out in the world and doing what we did before the pandemic. And it's harder to get people's attention. The generational differences will continue. The good news about that, though, is 51% of the wealth, according to Forbes, is in the hand of the boomers and older, only 9% in millennials. So don't ignore your older members. And they tend to be
Mhm.
older women and they're quieter, and you just really can't go after the younger generations without acknowledging that probably the people in your congregation that will make or break you in the planned giving area are going to be those older widows. What we had known or we're experiencing, but now we have proof, since 2015 the average giving was about 2,500 from the normal household. So with inflation and everything, 2,500 pledge is no longer has the same value to your institution. So there should probably be a program for those middle pledges to help them, increase. I think at Christ Church at one point, and now my information is outdated because I don't work there, but at one point, maybe 60 or 70% gave the same pledge year after year. So we would do targeted calls and mailings to them. What's hopeful is 78% of the affluent households are giving at a local level. So if we can keep their attention and engage them authentically as a parish, they will respond. Um, Giving to religious organizations is still the highest. That will go down with the generational shift, but we still have their attention right now. Affluent women make 85% of the donations. So we have a lot of members who they come but not and are active and volunteer, but not necessarily their spouses. So, look at that group. um, 54% of the most fluent members, 5 million to 20 million in assets, plan to establish a giving vehicle in the next 3 years. I picked mine up today from my attorney in South
Mhm.
Carolina. But, I cannot stress enough how planned giving is the answer to all of this. 94% of volunteers give, and they give almost 4 times as much as their counterparts. But the key with the very affluent is to find volunteer activities that fit their schedules, and it's invitational rather than putting it in a church. They tend to have more than one church, they travel a lot. Um, so that is notable and hopeful.
And I just want to come back to something that maybe some of our listeners might not be aware of. You mentioned liquid wealth studies that can be bought. Can you go into that in a little more detail for people who aren't familiar with that?
Well, every time a church does a capital campaign and they bring in a consultant, you have the option to do a study of who's in your congregation, and you put their name and the address. And having been a development professional at Yale, I could look Bill up at any point.
Guilty as charged.
It's amazing what everybody knows about us, from what we give to. It's all online, your political party. I mean, it is really frightening how much the anyone can have access. So you would never want to make it public that you were doing that, but you could, if you're thinking about a capital campaign, which if you're not in one or you haven't just finished one, you should be. Every 3 to 5 years, you should be planning for one. Just to bring in someone to do an analysis of your congregation. We don't have in the larger endowed parishes the ability to be all things to all people. But if the rector and the stewardship director, if you have one, don't know who that 3% is in your congregation, Lauren Mead used to say you're committing institutional suicide. But it's authentic relationship. It's not just because they're wealthy. It's because they're members of your congregation and they're partners with you in your ministry, and or could be partners with you. So it's not an inauthentic look at the congregation, but it is a very strategic look at the congregation to say, in the next 3 years, if this group of people are planning to do a planned gift, have I had a conversation or a lunch or some authentic connection with them one on one, so that they'll even think of my parish or organization. We don't laugh at Merrick Zabriskie, but he is one of the best in, saying, let's have lunch, let's have breakfast. Do you want to grab a cup of coffee? But that's how you get to know one on one what people are
Yeah,
worried
yeah.
about, what their kids are going through. You just don't know from the smiling face as you shake their hand on a Sunday morning.
Not a bit of it. And coming back again to this point about affluent women, we say here in make 85% of giving decisions. I should have said participate in 85% of giving decisions, meaning that it's either themselves by themselves or with a partner. But the point that we are here to make, and Pam, I think it's a well researched point, is that behind the person who signs the check, if it's a paper check, or who clicks the ticker, if it's an online donation, is often another person. And so it behooves the parish or the development staff to know who that other person is, so that when the person who is the front line of that giving operation is no longer there, you're there to say, yes, we know you already, we understand what your preferences are, and hopefully you've been able to cultivate both members in that partnership.
Well, and to that point, we had a couple at Christchurch who I adored. The wife was very active, and we never saw the husband. And I went to make a capital campaign call, and he said, "Lucky for you, the Princeton person just left." And when I asked him how much he was going to ask me for and why, he said, "Well, I always decide by the length of the driveway." And he said, "I'm so offended, and I don't go to church, but you're going to get Princeton's gift today as well as what I had already planned and discussed with Cecile." So you just don't know the motivation. But my one recommendation is, even though one of the partners or spouses don't attend church, to, if possible, share an authentic moment with both of them, a meal, a visit, a cocktail, whatever, but to include both of them and not discount the person that you don't see on a regular basis.
Yeah, and this is another thing, Pam, and we'll go to the actionable in a minute. I want to make sure that we have time for the chat and the questions and answers too. But increasingly, as we see, again, I'm in the Northeast, but particularly in the Northeast, I'll be very broad, not just Episcopal, but Christian parishes having to close, having to consolidate as the number of attendees goes down. There has been in journals, for example, the Chronicle of Philanthropy, others, the question raised, well, but for these institutions, what will happen? When the social benefit that's being provided by religious institutions is no longer there in the same scale, what will society look like, and how will those services or that comfort be provided? And to your point about having that cup of coffee or that conversation, you don't necessarily have to hit somebody over the head with it. But if they were to think about, supposing this parish or this diocese or this set of programs were simply extracted from the community and we're no longer there, what would life be like? And what is it worth to a donor or to a parishioner to see to it that that doesn't happen?
And to that point, when I was president of the consortium, we did a study with the think tank out of Palo Alto, Institute for the Future, and he felt that the Episcopal Church had the greatest opportunity with the working from home, with our broad, open tent, conservative and liberal, to capture people in the community and bring them back into relationship because of the isolation in society. There was a speaker at Christ Church. London now has, or England now has, a ministry of loneliness because people could not identify that they had had one personal, meaningful touch in their lives in the last month. So I do think the church, if we really are intentional and look at the statistics and what's around us, not only around money, but around isolation and mental health, that we have a great opportunity to organize and really mobilize for society.
Yeah, and this partly goes to some themes that will be raised at the Episcopal Parish Network conference, which are current in the Episcopal Church, which is the transformation of the church away from a thing that's centered around buildings and regular services and so on, and something that becomes perhaps more fluid in communities, not giving up those things that are our heritage, but not necessarily also clinging to them if they can't be supported in the same way anymore. And that's another type of conversation that can be held with potential donors and those who are willing to support a mission that may not be able to be supported in the same way as in the past.
Mm-hmm. A lot of endowed parishes at one point hired a registered nurse because Stephen Ministry could not support parishioners that lived alone getting out of the hospital way too early and anybody to coordinate their care. So and it's unique to all of our individual situations. So you can't make a blanket response for the Episcopal Church, but the trick is to analyze what's going on in your locale and how you can address it.
So looking at the actionable items here, we've already touched on some of these, Pam. Digital platforms, obviously that's something that can be constructed and that I think is basically a thing that almost every parish should have. You've talked about identifying the individuals, developing those authentic relationships and engagement opportunities. But talk a little more about this intergenerational laundry list we've got here. Travel, books, family giving, plan giving, and so on and so forth. How does that play out?
Well, I always hold up Mark Anschutz in Texas, who raised $4 million of a $4 million budget, operating budget from his congregation, didn't have an endowment, and they did 40 travel trips a year, which were intergenerational, which, fit different. They had waiting lists to go on them. So I think to develop opportunities for your congregation, busy people, it's not the same volunteer of 1990 even. It's a volunteer that
Mhm.
can give you one day. We had one of the wealthiest members of Christ Church that said, every time I want to try to sign up for Midnight Run to feed the homeless in New York, it's full because the same volunteers were always keeping the programs going. So to have one or two special opportunities where and I said, the next one that happens, I'll save. He wanted to take his son, and I said, I'll save you 2 spots. So the other thing is there was a member, one of our senior wardens, Dick Pivorato, and he at once a year would give all of his grandchildren and children a sum of money, and they had to research where they wanted to give it and why. But they had a very intentional conversation about giving, and his goal was to teach the next generation. So a donor advised fund set up for future generations that is, for your grandchildren would be one. I was at a endowed parishes meeting at the Waldorf, and this man came over and knelt at my feet and said, I've been looking for you for years. At some conference he had said, I won't be here to know my grandchildren as adults. And I said, well, then why don't you take your philosophy of giving and meaning of life and your favorite books and set up a donor advised fund so they will know you, but through a different way. And he had done it, and he had done it for each of his grandchildren. He was a doctor. Um, so there are creative ways we can help our members interact with a generation that probably aren't going to be going to church. I had my 11-year-old granddaughter here over the weekend. My husband had surgery, and she said, why do you even go to church? What's that all about? And I said, I'll take you sometime, but it's where I find love and peace. So there's a whole generation out there that really needs to be gently engaged. But the most important thing is to have a planned giving program. It has to be simple, sustainable, and it has to be regular. And, my favorite definition of planned giving was Fred Osborne from the Episcopal Church Foundation. It's the plans we make for the property we have to benefit the people and the places we love. And then he would always
Mm.
add, or I would add, and those God calls us to serve. If you lead with Christian witness at life's end, your members they know how to do the donor advised funds and the trust and everything. What you need to do though is I just wrote my will. The attorney kind of looked at me. I said, now I'd like a Christian preamble in there. And she said, I've never had anybody ask that in 30 years. And I said, it's simple. I've lived my life in Christ and I die in Christ. And I hope my heirs will, that we'll meet again in eternity. It's not overly, but there are ways to teach even on our dying the next generation so that they don't. The last thing I want my kids to hear about me is that I believed in God and my faith, not what my assets were and who got them. So, there are a lot of easy things to do. The best time to do a planned giving program is Legacy Sunday in New York, which is the baptism of Jesus, where it's after Christmas, but before Lent. Nobody wants to talk about Lent, about dying in Lent, even though that's what Lent
Mm.
is. So All Saints, the music programs are beautiful, and they're so, after Christmas, before Lent, talking about beginning your life in Christ and ending your life, and then around Memorial Day, having something in the rector's home just to, affirm, because most of the gifts that people make for their churches are not irrevocable, meaning they can change at any moment. So you just really need to thank them over and over again. So maybe we can.
And you're so eloquent. Let's turn to the chat and the Q&A and see what's in there.
All right. So, Joe. Well, I'm not seeing any. Joe, am I wrong? You might want to, it might.
Pam, you have a question of from Don Anderson. I wonder if it is volunteers who give or givers who volunteer. Older people have more money to give and more time. There's one note/question for you.
I think it's a combination of both, but I will tell you, having just retired again, I on January 23rd, where I was helping with a case for love, you go from being active and engaged to 40 hours a week. I mean, some days it's like, what day is it? And I find myself, making meals for people that have had surgery or doing, the day-to-day Christian things. But there's a whole generation. I mean, I'm not even 70, and I have hopefully 20 years of vitalness to give to something. So I did volunteer on the stewardship committee of my church down here and All Saints. And, you know, I don't think we would have gotten as involved if they hadn't kind of pulled me in to volunteer, but that was by invitation. And so, I just think it's a matter of knowing who you need to get involved and then inviting them into something that is meaningful. Now, she did ask me if I wanted to answer the phones, and I have to tell you, I have no interest in answering a church telephone. To me, I would have to drive 40 minutes to get there and, get dressed. And, that's not meaningful. Ask me to go feed the homeless and, the bishop wants to do a church plant here. You have to analyze the person's talents before you invite them to. It's not just some menial volunteer, although, I do the Sunday morning coffee hours. But, it's got to have meaning and use your talents too.
Another question.
And to address another part of that question, Joe, we do see significant volunteering activity by the next gen. There is a higher incidence of volunteering, to be sure, among those who are older than 42. But again, Pamela, I think that addresses your point. Some of those may be retired and they just have more time. But I would push back a tiny bit on the questioner and say, I don't have a slide on this to give you right now, but I don't see the next gen as being necessarily slackers when it comes to volunteering.
That's great, Bill. A question for Bill real quickly, because we don't have too much time left, but Bill, does your study reflect or account for mega gifts that might distort long-term trends, coming from our friend Bruce Smith?
Yeah, averages are always a little bit tricky. And what we do with the study is the people who are in the opinion research firm Ipsos that we use, they use a division of their firm called the Knowledge Panel. And so they are recruiting families that are willing to take these questions. There are probably some mega gifts in there, but I would not think at this level. I mean, to think about a person between $5 and $20 million in net worth giving $50,000 a year, that feels about right. As a matter of fact, some would say that it could be, perhaps more, but that's an average. So we also look for medians versus averages and try to be sure that we're not too crazy with this. So I think we can stand on these numbers. I'm not saying that would be true for every single community in the country, because there are different levels of affluence at different places in the country and different traditions of giving. But probably where I would close would be to say, don't worry so much about the dollars. Think about your community and think about the motivations, because the motivations are authentic and the motivations cut across all of these participants. And those are what can be used wherever you happen to be, I would argue, to get that conversation going and get those people more confident to volunteer and to give.
That's great. Thanks, Bill. We have a question that I think both of you can address from Lisa Hunt, the rector at St. Stephen's in Houston. Who in the parish should have access to the wealth screening, tool?
I'd like to address that. When I got to my new parish here, the rector didn't even know what the pledges were. And it was surprising. I think only two people really should have access to that, the rector and say the stewardship director or the person responsible on, you know, it's not a broad base thing.
Mm.
It's only the need to know because and you should never acknowledge publicly, but that you've done it. But 20 years ago, parishes all over the endowed parish world were doing it. They weren't acknowledging it because it felt so inauthentic. But we're also limited with staff that we have to do two things. We have to address the planned giving crisis or, really capture the ability in the next 3 to 10 years to be included in our members' wills and estate plans. And we have to train up the younger generation, but chances are we're not going to have access to them. And so the case for planned giving is even more critical than I think any of us realize. So you have to work smart and really know who you're talking to right now.
That's great. Thanks, Pam.
And Pam, I would add to that a tiny
Oh.
bit. This is not just a parish thing, what you're talking about. I was attending a secular conference of Support Foundations for Education, and one of the development advancement professionals there laid out exactly what you're describing. So this is very commonplace across the philanthropic world, and it's something that parishes should not be afraid to do.
That's great.
I just want to add, Joe, that in my 24 years at Berkeley, I always, when I ask people to give to the the Episcopal Seminary at Yale, I always talked about the seminary and the religious rather than Yale University. And the team at Yale Divinity School of 8 and the team of 1.5 at the seminary, we always raised more money because they were giving to the church and as a response to God. So I know based on experience that if you really are authentic and talk about Christian witness at life's end, that people will rise to the occasion and you'll be part of the legacy.
That's great, Pam. Thanks. We have a few more minutes, a couple more questions. From William Jordan, given the causes that motivate giving, does a church's work in that area better motivate people to give to the church rather than another issue-focused NGO?
So what I would say in my slide where it said digital platforms for giving with compelling pictures, I think it's more important than ever to tell how, 60% of our churches have schools. What is the human need we're addressing? Whether it's mental health, loneliness, racial justice and training. It's more important than ever to tell our story, to tell it when you send the pledge reminder, to say thanks, for your generosity. It has enabled these 5 things, but to tell the story of what the money, don't ever talk about the institutional need. Nobody cares that our costs have gone up. Their costs have gone up as well. The other thing I want to add sorry.
No, you go ahead.
That I remember Sam Lloyd, who was such a wonderful leader in our church, called me and he said, more for the first time ever, I'm hearing from people that they're having to support their children and their grandchildren. And that they have to not make as big a gift to the church. And that actually is happening in our country. And, I, support my 99-year-old mother and my 75-year-old artist brother. And, I just think you can't discount, and that is a form of giving. It's not the form we necessarily want, but I think it is a factor with this economy right now, and the employment and the aging populations, that more and more our members to have additional, our affluent members, additional responsibilities.
Yeah, and Pam, I just wanted to pick up on something you were saying about pledging. Of course, we're typically thinking historically about the pledge campaign and the pledge card and the check that's written once a year, and maybe a little bit extra comes in plate during the year. But I know at Christ Church, and I'm sure at many other churches, there's a facility to have it be a monthly credit card charge, so that it's not hitting you all at once. It's an amount that you've agreed to do, and it doesn't strain the budget as much. What's your experience with that?
Well, I think that's part of it, but the other bigger part are donor advised funds, or people don't want to pledge if they're trying to establish residency in a tax
Right.
advantaged state. And so we're seeing across the church fewer pledges, but greater dollars. And so you're going to see contributions. So you really need to track where they're
Hmm.
from and acknowledge them and treat them. But, the credit cards certainly, but, it's 3%, that the
Yeah.
church gets charged, but then they get their miles, and then they donate their miles back to the priest who needs to go do a funeral.
Right.
So, the other
Given
thing,
sorry, Pam, I'm just gonna, I love it's great. And everybody donate your miles to your priest, right? That's a good thing.
right?
We have two questions that we're gonna close with. The first is from Meredith. How do you suggest balancing planned giving, legacy, estate versus annual pledges? How do you balance giving for annual expenses and budget needs versus planned lump sums in the future? It's kind of a big one. Any quick answers on those?
The quick answer, and the Episcopal Church Foundation can help you. Jim Murphy, Bill can help you. But the real answer is most of the people that are going to have these larger estates are either not as liquid on a day-to-day basis, and they're worried about their big fear is they're going to live too long or die too soon, but either way they feel insecure about their day-to-day spending. And so, I would just work so hard for the annual appeal at Christ Church, and I'd raise 1.5 million. And, in 5 planned gifts, I'd get $2 million. So it is a balance, but to focus, if you go back to my original premise, is know who those 3% are and have a very authentic plan for them. And they'll tell you. I mean, I was the worst development director because I waited for people to tell me. And I know Bruce and a lot of people I'm seeing, on this call know that. It's not anything that you can say or do to make people give you more. You can only be in relationship with them and um, listen and really hear what their fears and their hopes and dreams are.
Knowing that we are right up to 4, right a little bit over, actually, I'm going to ask one last question. It's from our friend Merrick. What's the best way to recruit good volunteers? Is it a professional volunteer coordinator on staff, or do you have other suggestions?
You know, it really, to do it well, if you're only talking, I'm going to say for the general, to hire a professional volunteer is another staff expense. So I think if you know who those 10 or 20 key people are that could make or break you in a planned gift, then that gets turned over to either the rector or the rector and the stewardship director to make sure that there is an authentic trip interaction giving circle. Then I would what Merrick does so well is he has, we pack thousands of lunches, but it's a one day every 4 months. You leave feeling good and you've accomplished something. So I think it's more creating opportunities and telling people about them further in advance. And all universities, but certainly the Christ Church and endowed parishes, to travel with people and really get to know them is another great way to limit it to 5 days. And I know, Merrick, you're great at that. I haven't answered the question, but um, if you're only dealing with 10 people, then you can actually create a volunteer experience. I used to take all the large donors at Christ Church who gave 90% of the budget on a spiritual experience once a year. I'd take them on a spiritual tour, the Metropolitan. They climbed up on top of St. John the Divine arches. They were in a golf tournament with Bishop Burrell. I would create some fun church experience once a year for one day and invite key people. And my only fear was that the bus would have an accident and they'd all die. So,
Well, thankfully that
Yeah,
did
and
not
Pam,
happen.
if I could just
Bill, please, you had
jump
something.
through that for 1 second. Merrick, you are the star of this, but you also understand what it is to be an influencer. And I would argue or propose, Pam, what you were doing was to create a situation in which for that group, it was, to use a horrible word, cool to do the thing that you were proposing. And so how do you get that larger volunteer community? You have people who are influential who show that it is cool to do the thing, right? And then people will say, I want to do that too. That's fun. I want to be there. They might not come every single time, but they're going to come for the experience, and hopefully it becomes habit forming over time, I would propose.
and I would do like our Tanzania connection in Africa has been going on 25 years, and I would say 500 people have been there. Merrick's been there, and that shows human need. You can't get any poorer than Tanzania. And it's those experiences that get it out of their heads and into their hearts. And, we have waiting lists for people to go on those trips or to go to Israel. So it's dependent on your own congregation, and it can be just in the next borough of New York City, but it has to be meaningful and really kind of, you know, an example of Christian witness that they can feel at a very soul level.
That's great, Pam and Bill. Um, and it's a cool way to end this particular program. Thank you, everyone who joined. Thank you, Bill and your team, for your deep research, sharing it again this year with us.
Yeah.
We'll see you in Houston. Pam, thank you as always for your wisdom and insights from a career well done. And we look forward to seeing you in Houston and many of you all joining us for the upcoming conference, March 6th through 9th. Thank you all again, and we will see you soon. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Pam.
Okay, take care, everyone.